For decades, Australian servicemen and women have been exposed to aviation fuels as part of their day-to-day jobs. Now there's growing evidence that those fuels are toxic and cause long-term health effects. Former Army, Navy and Air Force personnel are demanding that Defence look beyond the small group it admits were harmed by the now infamous F-111 de-seal reseal project and investigate far more broadly. Dan Oakes and Sam Clark have the story.
So this is the kind of drum you use then, Mick?
This is exactly what we used to use, and there were two side by side and two mirror image on the other side.
Every day, Michael Connolly spent training on the firing range as a member of the crack SAS counter-terror unit ended the same way, up to his elbows in aviation fuel. Did you have any protective gear at all?
No, we just use our overalls, similar to this. This is actually a pair that were issued, and that was it. No gloves, you just roll your sleeves up and get on with it.
But just as Connolly and his mates were plunging their arms into the fuel, unprotected, their Air Force colleagues were being told to use a full-face respirator, apron and gloves when using jet fuel. Did it surprise you to find out that around about the same time you were using it for this purpose, the Air Force was advising people not to come into contact with it at all, and certainly not to use it for cleaning weapons?
Oh, very much so.
Mick Connolly was diagnosed with a rare blood cancer in 2007, which causes his body to produce too many red blood cells. The only treatment is to regularly drain his blood, so today he's making the 140-kilometre round trip to Perth for the procedure. He also takes medication daily for depression and anxiety.
Now, how have you been?
Well, the night sweats kicked in Tuesday.
Okay.
And then I get soaked from the crutch area right up into the neck. I get breathless, even when I speak. For a period there, I would get severe headaches that would last for weeks, not go away. And they're just some of the things, yeah.
Michael Connolly's condition has been linked in scientific studies to benzene exposure. It's a component of jet fuel used by the Australian Defence Force for decades.
I'm able to withstand having blood taken off normally.
Connolly says he is speaking up because he wants Defence to acknowledge that personnel were exposed to harm by jet fuel.
Irritable bowel syndrome, diverticulitis, forgetfulness, disturbed sleep patterns, depression, anxiety, vision problems, and was struck with a case of Bell's palsy, which I attribute to the benzene and the fuel exposure as well.
Hey Coop, you go down the park, go on the swing, and play in the swing, man.
Peter Jackson served in the Royal Australian Air Force and came into frequent contact with jet fuel.
I was in the movements trade, loading and unloading of military aircraft, C-17s, Hercs, King Airs, that like, and also refuelling aircraft, Hornets, Hercs, C-17s, and that as well.
In 2012, Jackson was depressed, having trouble sleeping, and was racked by headaches. He went to the medical officer.
And I tried to bring up the fuel, but I was told by a senior MO that because I wasn't female, I didn't work on the F-111 reseal, de-seal programs, and that I wasn't working in confined space, that it wouldn't have had an effect on me.
15 years ago, Defence and the Commonwealth Government were forced to admit that some personnel who'd worked inside F-111 fuel tanks were made sick by their work.
We accept a responsibility to those who may have been detrimentally affected.
The government and Defence insisted that the number of people affected was limited to those who had been exposed to solvents and sealants, not to jet fuel generally. But in 2006, Dr. Sam Brucey found that jet fuel may also have been a problem. He recommended that workplace safety procedures be urgently examined and a central register be set up to monitor exposure to toxic chemicals. How crucial is that type of monitoring?
Well, I see it as very crucial in the sense that it's almost a moral obligation that you don't forget about the people that have served you and your country. So yes, I believe it's important, and I would urge the proper structures be set up in order to do so.
To date, no such register has been established, but a study released by Defence this year confirmed his concerns. The study found that jet fuel is toxic to the body's cells. The author also recommended further research be done into the health of personnel who have been exposed to fuels of any type. This opens up the possibility that thousands of Defence Force personnel have been exposed to harm as a result of their work with toxic jet fuel. Kathleen Henry's husband Alan was an aircraft electrician for 20 years. He worked at the RAAF's Research and Development Unit and on the now infamous F111 program. Kathleen also worked on the base.
He was exposed to MEK, or methylethyl ketone, trichloroethylene, mil-spec, Texols, Allodyne, aviation gasoline, aviation turpentine, and endless numbers of other chemicals that were just used on a day-to-day basis within the service.
Alan Henry died in 2008 while battling the Department of Veterans Affairs, which initially refused to acknowledge that his leukaemia was caused by exposure to jet fuel. 18 months after he died, Veterans Affairs finally conceded its mistake.
So, Kathleen, can you explain to me what this document is?
Certainly, this is a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and in it they have made a decision that Alan's acute myeloid leukemia was caused by his exposure to benzene in aircraft fuels.
But the recognition came in 2009, a year and a half too late for Kathleen's husband.
He died heartbroken that he knew the cause, he knew the reason, he wanted to make sure that I would get looked after in the future, and because of that denial, he couldn't be confident that I was going to get help. And he felt like he had completely failed me and the family.
Now 7:30 can reveal that two former Army officers made Defence aware of the dangers of aviation fuel starting over 30 years ago.
And the big tanks I'm talking about, we get in there and we'd be cleaning, it'd be the fuel residue.
Mark McKeon was in charge of the Army's Petroleum Operation Unit in the early 1990s. He was sent to the UK to do the Petroleum Officers course and says the British soldiers were shocked when he told them it was common practice for Australian soldiers to climb into fuel tanks to clean them.
They were very specific. They were specific in the fact that the carcinogens in fuel, particularly aviation fuel, made it absolutely risky to get inside a tank and expose, because you can't suit people up with the correct cleaning equipment, and that was certainly their view.
McKeon says he returned to Australia and urged his bosses to change practices, but he was ignored.
I pleaded my case, but in the ethos of the Army, once you plead your case and you're told to go and do what you have to do, you go back and you do your job. So I went and did as I was told to do, and I started climbing into tanks and cleaning them as well. So I exposed myself knowing full well that we have potential long-term risks.
Mark McKeon's warning to Defence about exposing soldiers to jet fuel wasn't the first. 15 years earlier, Army officer Bob Ney had completed the same petroleum course in the United Kingdom. He too raised concerns, but when he moved on, they were soon forgotten.
Put it in simple terms, I was flabbergasted, because here were these people being trained for 18 months coming back to Australia, and basically a lot of this information wasn't being passed on.
Defence acknowledged less than optimal work practices with fuel may have affected personnel beyond those that worked on the F111s, but said that safety had now been improved. It refused to commit to investigating the effects of exposure on the thousands of current and former personnel who worked with jet fuel, saying it was waiting for the results of further research. 7 years after her husband, Alan, lost his battle with leukaemia, Kathleen Henry is still fighting. She says the time has come for Defence to acknowledge the harm caused by jet fuel. For Kathleen and dozens of other veterans and their families, anything less than a full investigation by Defence will be viewed as a betrayal.
We all joined the service to serve this nation, to stand with pride for our country. And if the service that we undertook cause us debilitating harm, then there has to be recompense. And the recompense has to come either from the government or from the industries that have created toxic chemicals without checks and balances.
Dan Oakes and Sam Clark reporting.